Schön, dass Sie alle da sind. Herzlichen Dank für die Einladung.
Thanks very much. Thank you for the invitation. We're now looking forward to a very exciting exchange with our speakers. I would like to introduce them all. I would like to introduce Professor Rupprecht Podszun. He's teaching civil law and German as well as European competition law at the Heinrich Heine University of Düsseldorf, where he's also director of the Kartellrecht Institute, the law on mergers and acquisitions. He's an affiliate research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich and was a visiting fellow of the University of Cambridge in 2017. He's received several awards for his teaching. Martin Schallbruch is senior researcher for cyber innovation and cyber regulation, as well as deputy director of the Digital Society Institute at the ESMT here in Berlin. He is chairman of the Digitization 4.0 Commission and is working on digitization issues. Before that, he spent several years as the IT director of the Ministry of the Interior in 2014 to 2016. He headed the desk for information technology, the digital society, and cybersecurity. Since 2018, he is also a visiting fellow at Stanford University, California. A very warm welcome to you all. Well, we've had a number of exciting presentations by way of introduction, and I think there's quite a lot to discuss. So I would like to start right away so that we can get into more detail on the platform economies issue. I thought it was very exciting what we've heard. Mr. Rühl, you gave the Facebook example, and you said that Facebook would only be useful if many other people are on Facebook, and gave it as an example of a network effect. But even there, of course, any further success of the platform is not a must. There are other factors that contribute to success, not just the number of people. Facebook Messenger is one, and WhatsApp after they bought WhatsApp, and Telegram and Signal and Wire and many other providers. So they all need to win from this competition. People need to post photos, and there are others like Snapchat and Instagram and many other such platforms. And the next thing we can expect is a decentralized version of Facebook. So how shall we think about network effects? I mean, what really is the salient point about a network effect? Well, maybe I think Facebook is an excellent example. So the network effect is something which works completely different from in the brick-and-mortar economy, because with every additional user of Facebook, the benefit of the platform increases. I mean, it's a bit like the more people on the platform, the greater the benefit, and that also enhances the value of the platform. A platform such as Facebook would then grow beyond that with the incremental cost of zero. Because if you have 1,000 or however many new users, it doesn't cost you any more. And this is what allows the exponential growth to happen. And in particular, that characterizes the platforms. With B2B, it may be a little more difficult, but these virtual platforms, I mean, their incremental costs are zero, and unlike some other platforms, the benefit of this platform will increase for every single user with every new user to join. Excellent, yes. But what does that mean for competition law? I mean, the Facebook example shows us that Facebook has lost a great deal of trust among the general public, and actually the number of users is going down. But without competition law having intervened. Yes, but you see, that's just about privacy, isn't it? And by the way, in this context, I mean, I was in Stanford briefly, one of the professors there, and the professor I heard had a wager 5 years ago with somebody in Berlin that the Americans would not care about privacy issues, which goes in the direction of what Dr. Flick said, where the European model might be copied. And here, indeed, privacy suddenly plays a much greater role in the United States. And I think that's also the Facebook issue now. It's not so much competition law that I don't think is a big issue for Facebook. How do you see this? Dr. Flick mentioned, well, she asked questions in her presentation, and one of the questions was, how much impact will value have on competition? I mean, things like privacy, data protection, data security. So that plays a role, particularly when it comes to trust. I would like to go back to the question as to which are the most important changes in the network, in the data and digital economy. And the network effect that we experience at platforms as well as other services, it's not the only impact. There are others to join, particularly because platforms play a very important role. And one important effect is scaling. An increasing role also is ascribed to what we might call integration ability. With those platforms with a strong position in the market, we see that they integrate a number of different services. And the ability to integrate is an important prerequisite for new services, new business models, i.e. for innovation ultimately. And this is run by platforms. So when we are asking, what do we need to do when we develop our competition law, and that's what our commission is doing, and we have to take into account that platforms are very much at the center of the debate. And on the one hand, platforms are innovators and accelerators of innovation, as Mr. Rühl put the case convincingly. But equally, platforms also provide mechanisms which lead to what one might call a dominant or certainly an enormous power when it comes to the digitization of business processes. So I believe we need new requirements and new criteria. And now I address your question as to the values which have an influence. The criteria we need to go beyond traditional competition law, because just by defining competition as the basic principle of our economy is not quite sufficient. And that is shown up by the fact that in many areas like data protection, plurality of opinion, and various other things, platforms already tackle these matters from a variety of different angles. So they have a regulatory effect in the market. And we have to look into all of this. We need to see what are the functions which platforms fulfill for us, and what do we want to use platforms for in the future, also in a positive way, and where might there be a potential for abuse, which we should cover by regulatory, among others, competition law means. And that's what Professor Kaiser says. We need to go beyond just competition law because that's not sufficient to cope with that phenomenon. I would like to pick up on something which Dr. Karl mentioned in his presentation, because he talked about market dominance and also mentioned that one might say, I mean, obviously he put it much smarter than I can, but he said market dominance is something which occurs once companies can either prevent or exclude a competitor from growing by their own dominant position in the market. Do we also have dominant market positions if a company or a platform is the only one to have access to extremely valuable data? You're starting with the one thing that lawyers really don't like, namely a concrete case. And now I have to solve that thorny problem within 2 minutes without having got you to sign a disclaimer that I'm not liable for anything if I should say something wrong. My colleagues can correct me, I hope. So the problems of the access to essential data is probably something which, for many of the companies that want to play a role in it, is the essential factor. Certainly for those companies active in a data-intensive area. That's a question that they keep asking us. Certainly, as a model, it's possible to say that a market-dominant position may occur once you have access to these assets in a particular beneficial way, because that also means that all subsequent competitors or subordinate competitors can be restricted. Can you give me as an example? Well, Facebook, since we talked about Facebook, I mean, the personal data that Facebook has collected of all of us is an enormous treasure trove of data that I can do all sorts of things with. I can imagine there are all sorts of identity management possibilities, applications that I might use. I think the standard example that we combat most, which is very much an issue both behind the scenes and openly, is going to be connected driving. When I'm looking at driver data, somebody has to give them to me. That's the person who has the data, whoever that may be at the moment. In Germany and in the European Union, and I think all over the world, there is no such thing as a clear law on how to ascribe data, as you know it from property law, IT law, intellectual property. Is nobody could say, if you generate a certain data, like you're sitting in your seat and the seat measures your weight in the car seat, well, we don't know who owns that data. Is it the individual or the car manufacturer or the software supplier or so on? Whoever owns the data will have an enormous advantage vis-à-vis everybody else who wants to offer any such services with the automotive sector. But opening up such data is complex. From an antitrust point of view, I would say, at the moment, as somebody else has said, it takes too long until we fight through one of these processes when ultimately BMW, just for want of another name, is obliged to do this or that and the other in data protection. We do need specific regulation in some sectors. And for PSD2, for example, we now have the opportunity to access certain bank client data. So that is very much a competition issue. And it really brings you back to what Mr. Schallbruch said. It goes back to this issue. It is a competition issue, but probably something which we'll have to deal with outside antitrust matters. If I translate what you've just said into the B2B section, let's take our platform as an example. We also generate data with our platform. And we can sell the data, for example, to insurance companies that offer insurance services for specific transactions, or sometimes we can sell it to banks who provide funding for individual or some transactions. But the privacy issue doesn't really enter into that. Shouldn't we differentiate here? When we're talking about privacy, shouldn't privacy matters be dealt with differently? And when we're talking B2B? May I answer that immediately? When it comes to personal data, in other words, data which ascribed to one particular individual, then we have a very strict regime, which is why privacy comes into play. But it's completely non-strict once people agree, and they can agree to divulge a lot of their data. And that's really what Google and Facebook excel at. Because if your insurance company asks you, would you like to provide all the health data you have for free so I can use them, everybody was going to say, oh, wait a minute, and think about it very hard. Google and Facebook somehow seem to have found a method to hold a carrot in front of our nose and we sign everything, tick every box they present us with. And the antitrust body has a more strict interpretation of these laws. But I think there is no obstacle that cannot be overcome. And when it comes to B2B, we would have a typical issue for personal data, but not necessarily for industrial data, although they may be just as important. How quickly a piece of equipment is going through wear and tear, how quickly a boiler is used up and obsolete, and these are other things. And let me add one more sentence before I come to the end. Maybe we should also give a little thought to the fact that when we're discussing platform, we are doing so with a mindset which is very much characterized by Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, the GAFA, the Big Five, maybe even Microsoft. I would call them super platforms, which have become so incredibly strong that from an antitrust eye, we're standing in front of them with huge eyes saying, how shall we get them to be little again? So this character as a super platform, which are immune to competition, is something which, among other things, is due to the fact that they simply have a capital strength and liquidity companies like yours can only dream of. Sorry to put it like this. But certainly, I mean, here we're talking about something where I have a problem, even if We should have huge competition law innovations. They simply buy it up and they gobble up and isolate themselves. And at the same time, you have Exxon Metals, like your platform which you presented, where again, sadly, we're far removed from this sort of dominant position, at least in the case of Klöckner, where we haven't got anything like the phenomenon I've just described, where from my angle, the public debate is really talking about the GAFA companies and consumer data. We must make sure we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in the sense that other platforms, B2B platforms and so on, shouldn't be tarred with the same brush because they haven't really got to that stage yet.
Das, was ich sehr interessant.
So what I think is really interesting here is that the European Union has tried to deal with data by having the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and this is based on the idea that all Europeans, no matter where their data might be across the globe, should have this protection. Unless a German, say, who's on Facebook or whatever it is. But when it comes to competition law, the idea is there that the European Union can intervene where there are influences on the European market from external factors. And this may come from the fact that data which give you advantages on the European market, or would, can be accessed by companies outside the European Union or are owned by them. So it's sort of the other way around, if you see what I'm saying. So it's not that your citizens are physically here in the European Union and then our protection is conferred to them outside of Europe, but rather we have to think about what's happening here in Europe on the European market with data that we do not own here, that are elsewhere. So what's your take on that? Well, I don't see a massive difference here because the General Data Protection Regulation works on the principle of the market, i.e. the core is offers made in Europe. So I lived in California, for example, last year, and the services that I used there, even if I used ones of Google, were not covered by the European data protection law. And then the aspect that you referred to in your question, I'd just like to say that we have the problem that increasingly we have a global market situation where services are introduced in this, that, and the other country, where data are being pushed back and forth across borders, and regulation only ever refers to individual economic areas. And there's a trend that I'm seeing increasingly as a result of this by regulators to try to have a sort of obligation to localize data or to somehow restrict transnational data, which we do with GDPR. The Russians, for example, are now introduced a localization obligation as well. But what we have to do is think about how we can get out of this situation. And the General Data Protection Regulation, whatever one may say against it, is essentially a successful example of what to do. When I started in Stanford yesterday, even though I'm an IT specialist originally, I'm rarely invited to talk about technical innovation from Europe, but I'm constantly being invited to talk about GDPR, which to begin with I thought was a bit of a drag, but did it happily, because what I found out in the process is that by having a unified data protection regime, we're sending out a signal across the globe. And there are 12 countries across the globe that have got systems that are essentially based on GDPR in South America, in India, and in many other places as well. They're sort of copying our model. And no matter what ends up happening in the future, this is something that we can really be proud of. And then to go a step further from your question, perhaps, I think we can also learn that if we adapt our competition laws a bit, it's very similar. There may well be many countries in the world who are currently thinking, what's Europe doing? And it's the same with the US. They're, looking at the various free trade agreements and looking at what we're doing as well. So data protection is so important in the consumer sector that we do need to have competition law to match our data protection law. And then we have an opportunity to achieve a kind of transfer of the good result that we got from GDPR. This may influence the world in the area of competition law. So perhaps we could talk a bit about your agile policy making. We heard agile used in both talks. So having agile competition for Europe, what does that really mean? What do we mean when we say agile in a world with AI and blockchain and all the rest? Tell us more. Well, I think the question is a very difficult one for lawyers to answer because it's very much part of who we are that we are not agile. That, you know, the law has a certain stability, legal certainty, and therefore it's a bit cumbersome and slow. So it's a contradiction in terms to say everything has to be fast, smarter, more agile, etc. But having said that, people like Mr. Rühl will have experienced this again and again, that the law tells you what to do roughly, but when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of it and you have a case where you have a conflict and you're trying to do something new, this very slow process unfolds and you're suddenly thinking, oh, this stability that the law is supposed to be communicating here isn't really what you might think. And I think Mr. Kahl was right when he said that the processes have to get much quicker, the cases have to be dealt with more quickly, the courts have to be able to think more technologically, and technological aspects have to be factored in. At the moment, the Commission and the Federal Cartel Authority are deciding about these things on their own. They should have IT experts to help them. But I think what would really be a change for us would be if we could have case law and regulation be seen as a kind of trial and error process where we're constantly tweaking the results and adapting them. Because then the law would still have it would lose some of its normative power, perhaps, but you would have experimental jurisprudence. You know, if you're talking about GDPR here as an example, this was 2012 that we started with negotiations on this. In 2016, it was approved. 2018, it came into power. And in that time, Google has grown exponentially. So our attitude to data has changed quite massively. And as soon as that thing's in force, the German industry is outraged and has all these problems. And we really have no chance to tweak it, to improve it. Everyone in Brussels will say, look, I'll do anything, but I'm not going to reopen the whole negotiation process of the GDPR. I'm not going to go there. And that's one of the weaknesses that we have to overcome in the law, in the legal system. How would you imagine this happening? Would it be a kind of regulatory sandbox that we've seen in the financial market, or would it be different? Well, there are lots of different options here. I mean, something that I wasn't familiar with for a long time are experimental clauses in laws. You take a law and you write into the law, you can try this, that, and the other thing out, and then we'll see how things pan out. You know, or certain sunset clauses where this law expires automatically or it has to be evaluated and approved again. For example, or regulatory sandboxes that the German Ministry of Economics has a real lab project at the moment, which is a bit like sandboxes. I think we're blurring the boundaries a bit between the two concepts. But what we're trying to do is create islands of innovation, and we're just going to try a few things out, experiment. Or another example for experimental jurisprudence, as I understand it, for lawyers, it's of course hard to imagine, but you could have the GDPR introduced first in Sweden and then see how it works in Sweden as a pilot project. And if it goes well, we'll roll it out for the rest of Europe. And then maybe the collateral damage would be less. But you have to do a trade-off between the undue advantage or disadvantage that the Swedish population would have to endure as a result. So these are difficult legal questions where you're talking about competition advantages, level playing field, and all the rest. So how does all of this sound for you from the perspective of the corporate approach, experimenting in laws and things like that? Well, I was indeed in Brussels when the GDPR, it doesn't distinguish between private and corporate data. And I went to the Commission then and spoke to the Commissioner about this issue, who understood entirely and said, yep, we've got to change this, we've got to change that, we've got to address it immediately. And in an hour, he had to go to an interview. And then the head of his office said, do you know how long that's going to take if we do that here in Brussels? And he sort of explained it to me and said 5 years minimum, at which point I said, we can forget it, you know. So whether it's going to be if it's going to be successful at all, it has to be fast. 5 years. It's just not worth bothering with there. But at the same time, you also have to distinguish here between the fact that companies themselves, between companies themselves and Europe or the country that the companies are in. I mean, major corporations tend to be structured globally. And if in Europe, for whatever reason, some kind of antitrust law prevents me from doing something, it means we have a level playing field here in Europe regarding our platform issue as well. And as long as it's a level playing field in Europe, as a company, you can live with it because, we've got our issues in the US, etc. But the question is whether Europe can live with that or Germany. It's also about competition. We have to distinguish between the competitiveness of a country or of Europe and the company itself. They're not necessarily the same. And I do think that policymakers often don't understand this difference, that we as companies, if in doubt, have the option to relocate elsewhere. If things aren't panning out here, we can do things elsewhere. But I think this is something that policymakers don't really think through sometimes. I wonder if there's another aspect I can add here. I would agree with what you've said. And I think the instruments that you've described are ones I all know, and I think they're all good in their own way. But one thing I've noticed, and this is an appeal to lawyers in the room perhaps, in Germany, we have a tradition of regulating everything very precisely, and we have done this extremely with digitization. And I'm part of the problem. For 15 years, I was in the German Ministry of the Interior, and I was involved with lots of different laws and regulated everything in detail. Because if you're talking about balance of probabilities and coordinating with the EU, etc., you do end up regulating everything in more and more detail, and particularly in the area of digitization, digital markets. This means that we are in a situation where we don't know what's actually going to happen, but we try to sort of predict the future and then regulate it to bits. And we have regularly gone belly up in this. I mean, the whole digital signatures being regulated before they're being used. The result of the law is that that wasn't even used here, because in accordance to German law, it just is far too complicated. And there are various changes on copyright law that we've made, thinking about how copyright's going to be. And, when we first did it, the first version, there were no streaming services, and then they grew exponentially, but they didn't come up in our copyright law. So we have to come up with a method that focuses more on principles, as we sometimes did, for example, when we're saying platforms are not liable for content that they didn't put in themselves. That's a hugely innovation-driving approach. And now the legislators are saying, oh, no, that's terrorist, and that's hate speech, and that is an infringement of copyright law, and that is a product which is plagiarized, etc. And we're getting more and more precise. As a result, we are not covering innovation, and the data protection law is a particular case of this. I published a book last year, and there was one chapter where I took an app that I had on my smartphone, you may have it as well, which manages the data from various different accounts to give me an overall view. I looked at this in 30 pages of data protection law, and then I thought, if I do it any bigger, no one will buy the book. And yet I couldn't describe this app in 30 pages because there's the Apple message notification service in California. You cannot describe it in terms of data protection terms. And it's an app where you just click it and then up it pops. It's like buying a bread roll. You don't need 30 pages to describe how to do it, really. So the result is we have a complexity of regulation that has to change. Okay, so what you're just describing here reminds me very much of the debate that we had in the legal sciences from the American perspective, rules and standards. And what you're describing here is that what we should do is get closer to standards and not having detailed, precise rules. But the disadvantage of that is that our companies may have a certain legal uncertainty in terms of how it's going to be applied. Yeah, but there are tools to deal with this. Let me give you an example of a success. First in Germany and then in Europe, we passed a law on critical infrastructure and protecting it from hacking. That the providers and operators of critical infrastructure have to be state-of-the-art in terms of their hacker protection. But the companies were saying, ooh, well, we don't have real legal certainty there. And so what we added is that companies have the option to set trade association standards within each one and various ones have done this, the wastewater companies, public transport companies, etc. And as a result, they have a bit more legal certainty, and their standard is updated, and it's the trade associations that do this. And who acknowledges this? I mean, who certifies this? Oh, well, there's some federal agency that does that. And are they in a position to actually assess this? Well, there's a general sort of grid of what the state of the art is, and you have to sort of tailor it specifically. I mean, your industry is a very specific one, but if you're talking about wastewater as an industry or hospitals as an industry, and the legislature isn't saying, oh, I want to understand the IT system protection of hospitals. I mean, they don't, in a way. You've regulated this area, but if you are to allow innovation, it has to have a certain openness. This brings me to antitrust law, because in antitrust, we find ourselves in the pleasant situation that we regulate very little. Very little is regulated. Like no other antitrust and any other area are things so vague. They're individual sentences, and we do unbelievable things with that. We say, right, keep out of your platform. Facebook isn't allowed to merge its data with Instagram data. So we can do some amazing things with it, even though it isn't all spelled out. And Mr. Kahl talked about this. It depends very much who is taking this law in their hands. And that's what's good about the debate, because Mr. Mundt and Ms. Westphal have managed to politicize competition law. But you just talked about this, Mr. Kahl. You could imagine the opposite. Ms. Vestager's predecessor had to deal a lot with state aid law, for example. And we just had the financial crisis, and that was a big issue. And that sort of landed in his mandate more than Ms. Vestager's dealing with. And this transfers everything onto a political level, which is quite right that we have this debate here. Because, of course, the question is, what kind of trade and industry do we want to have here? What can companies do and what can't they do? I mean, you just referred to the sort of economic location argument that we know well from the 90s. But, of course, now we've got things like the Gilets jaunes who are debating the whole competition issue, too, or privacy issues and other issues, too. So I think there, as a social debate, we have to talk about what kind of business activities we want to have here. And I wouldn't want to get all of this shifted just to the technological side of the equation or leave it all to the antitrust agencies. Well, this brings me to the question of values, Gilets jaunes and all that. What about things like democracy, sustainability, against the background of climate change, social issues, Gilets jaunes? What does all of that have to do with our values? And how can we distinguish here between commercial laws? What do we do differently in terms of competition law than we do with trade laws? What are sort of the ways in which we implement European values? That would be a question for you, surely, wouldn't it, Mr. Quirm? Well, essentially, we're always very pragmatic as companies here. I mean, you were just talking about the fact that we might have a certain uncertainty. Well, I'd rather have a bit of uncertainty than too strict laws in place. Just to give you an example of how we deal with one of these issues. For example, I've got my data protection commissioner who reports directly to me. I've removed that person from compliance because there's just no wiggle room at all in the area of compliance. But here, with all of these issues, there is a sort of gray area. There is a certain uncertainty in data protection. And to make sure that I'm not endangering the company, I make these decisions. I decide how much we want to use the uncertainty areas and have all the risks explained to me first. And if we're not going to use it at all, then we're not going to make much progress with lots of things, particularly around trade. So we can live with it as it is. I would say if you regulate things too strictly, that would cause us more problems in this way. Would you like to say anything about that? No, you go ahead. Okay, in that case, I'd like to open the question to the floor. If anybody'd like to ask a question. I'm afraid this question is off mic and the interpreters cannot hear it. But here's the answer. Well, the question is a difficult one. You know, trade law depends on the disposition of the person acting. It's sort of civil law among companies. Civil law is not dispositive. It's about the subject matter dealt with in the contract. Now, in competition law, you're talking more about what kind of, business world do we want to have here? Let me go over here. I'm sort of in the way. And there we can say we've got an objective behind this open competition. I appealed for saying that we shouldn't be fixed on what the result is, and I think this has to continue. Now, we've seen the rise of consumer protection in German law as a justification for competition law. I mean, there is a value here. Trade law is neutral, and it's up to the companies. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any values, but I would say it manages without normative values. It wants to see a facilitation of interaction between companies and consumers. Now, competition law can set clear targets and objectives, and the European competition law does this. We have got particular exceptions where we say here the full hardness of disruptive processes shouldn't be there. Agriculture is one. I named it, where we said, okay, we want our farmers to earn money. We want our cows and pigs to grow up nicely and live decent lives, and consumers should have to pay for this. We don't want to have really brutal competition here. So I would say that there are certain values that we want and have to integrate into competition law, but we have to do it in a normative way. It cannot be in the personal value-based scope of the person enforcing the law and giving them so much latitude to decide things. There has to be a stronger rule of law here. All right. Anyone else who would like to ask a question? Go right ahead. Again, this question is unfortunately off mic. We need stronger rule of law, but what I just understood is that as lawyers, we have to take a certain distance from this rule of law. And I thought it was very intriguing what you just said, because we can't cope particularly well with the regulations that we have. So how can we take the leap to keep up to date with our laws? Keep up to the pace of change? Well, there are two aspects we have to consider here. One is the question of what sort of tools do we need? How can we accelerate the pace at which we approve laws? And then there's the question of how can certain values that we have be actionable in a court of law? Or how can we formulate them such that it's just not completely arbitrary? One example that I'm thinking of is the Bayer-Monsanto case, which you'll be familiar with. The European Commission has never had so much post as it had when they were examining this case. Thousands of emails and letters were written to them about this case by concerned citizens who asked the commissioner to prevent this merger. I don't know if the head of Bayer was one of them. Perhaps he should have done, based on recent developments in the US. But basically, the commissioner wrote back to everybody and said, sorry, environmental protection and diversity of seeds and strengthening the farmers in India, or whatever the arguments were, are not a standard for competition. Competition means we're looking at efficiency, innovation, consumer protection, but we don't cover all of these more vague values. And if we were to ask the question of do we want Europe's values to be factored into competition as global policymakers, as you called it, if we want to do that, let's go away, first of all, and think about what are the European values that we're talking about. Maybe the rule of law is the clearest one, and the principle of competition, fair competition, is one too. And now we're in a position that I experience as a position of fear or a position of weakness, where companies in Europe and economic policymakers in Europe are afraid they're going to miss the boat. And from a position of fear, driving policy and pushing other values in front of you, this is a concept that I feel extremely uncomfortable with, to put it mildly. Because my worry is that an attempt is being made here to save something because we've lost ground somewhere else. And this is with something where we don't even know how we can deal with it. I mean, antitrust law has a very strong leverage. There's a commission, and they just fine Google 4 billion. Who dares do such a thing normally? They can, they do, and that means that maybe they'll be able to strengthen farmers in India and diversity of seeds. This is the kind of logic behind it. But I think we have to be cautious with this sort of thought, because if you have an institution with so much power that you've created, then you have to ensure that they are subject to the rule of law, closely bound to it. Sure, we should push the other values, but I find it hard to imagine that in Germany or on a European level, there could be somebody like Ms. Vestager who will say, right, I'm going to use the same dynamism to intervene in another field besides competition to solve other problems that are important to us too. I am just much more cautious about the debate around values here, because it's just much harder to deal with in a court of law. And of course, the companies will be thinking about whether or not it's worth going to court and maybe challenging these things or not. Right, coming back, Dr. Flick, to your question of Europe as a global policymaker. Well, I don't think it's going to work via just the law. It's more going to be about knowing what we want. I mean, every area of life is digitized to bits, from our household, communication via our devices. We've already heard about cars and the healthcare system. But the whole question of how do we do this isn't going to be just about how do we regulate, how do we create framework conditions for companies. It's about what we want, what are our objectives. I mean, agriculture, we've got clear objectives, pro-farming, if you like. And I think it's the same in other areas as well. We can't just talk about values and guaranteeing them. We have to look at what areas we want to achieve how. I'm afraid I said this example the first time 6 months ago, but it's still true. In Europe, in the area of in Germany, in the area of public services, services that are ones that the government has to do. We have fewer projects around artificial intelligence. Then we have bodies that look at ethical problems about artificial intelligence. And that's just wrong, because I think globally, in healthcare, in education, where, in all manner of areas, even driverless cars, we would be able to set an example if we do something consistently and make sure it works in terms of the rule of law. Obviously, it has to be dealt with and governed by a rule of law. We have to ensure that there are democratic scrutiny processes involved as well. And I think we can do this well. And we've seen this in other areas as well, the GDPR, for example. But I think we should have regulation that doesn't go into so much detail. But I would say look at the individual sectors of our life and digitize them all. The healthcare system has been mentioned already. This is an extremely government-dominated area. The provision of, there's a self-determination of all of the stakeholders in the healthcare system. But we would have to change things here if we want to make progress. This is one of the battlefields of digital markets and will remain this for the years to come, I think. And on the one hand, people have very high expectations of what you can achieve with digitization for their health so that they can live a longer life. But at the same time, there are a lot of worries as well. And we can't regulate this through the law. We have to be an example for other countries. Go ahead. Your guy, just one question that fits this whole debate about value is the question of platform cooperation. Treber Scholz, for example, is one of the pioneers in the area, professor at the New School in New York. And if we're talking about platform economies, a question I have for you is, what do you basically think about this? Could this be an area in which Europe maybe sets a signal and takes on a pioneering role? Well, I think that follows on very well what we just heard here. You know, you sort of intuitively want to agree with them and say, yes, innovation, education, research, let's invest big time in AI, and then maybe things will go well. And then, you know, this is how I've understood your intervention. And then we can maybe set certain international standards in the process. But at the same time, the question with ideas like these is, are we at its mercy already, or is there a way of not being at its mercy? And two books that impressed me recently, one is Jozan de Zubov's book about surveillance capitalism, and the other is Asha Bember, The Critique of Black Reason. Two books written by intelligent people. And there are many who represent them or agree with them, perhaps not so much in this room as in other spaces, but ones that criticize this digitization very, very much. I don't have a solution for it. I agree with you on the one hand wholeheartedly. And I think, oh, don't start setting AI and data protection standards. Do something, get something up and running. And on the other hand, I think, you know, we can't just be trying to jump on the bandwagon the whole time and have this sort of reflected intellectual view of things that we've acquired recently, and talk to people like Zukov and Bemberg, or rather listen to them and say, you know, the last 5 minutes in the car where we're just staring at the windscreen, that we should commercialize them too. As Bembert says, you know, modern slavery has taken on a whole new form. This is why it's called a critique of black reason, because every single detail of our most intimate desires of our body is split down, broken down, and put on the market, and is being sort of grazed and turned into goods. I mean, we need to look with greater optimism into the future, where we don't necessarily jump on every bandwagon and follow every hype. I don't take a position. I don't know what my position is, rather. Okay, just regarding the question about platform corporationism, I don't think we have a real chance in economy-driven competition, but I believe that we live in a world in which we have organized many things as goods in the public sphere, like culture, education, a lot of public transport and transport infrastructure as well. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how can we get all of this into a digital platform world without having the aspect of it all being managed in the interest of public good, where citizens can perhaps play a role as well, and where the public responsibility is preserved and there's democratic scrutiny. This is something that concerns me increasingly, because I see that in many areas where it is about the provision of these public services, the platforms compete with the government. I mean, Google has digitized more books than all German libraries together. This has got to be a very bad thing. The government is spending less on digitization of cultural assets than here, for example, for the German Historical Museum across the road. Less money for digitizing German cultural assets than for one museum. So if we're talking about services in the public good, we need to get better. And if we're talking about publicly supported platform models that perhaps emerged from civic society ones, we need to fund more. For example, in terms of public service broadcasters, that's another issue where this debate is going on. I'm afraid we have to wrap up this conversation, which I would like to do now, but thank all of the speakers for being here, and I hope that we will continue to discuss in the breaks. Thank you.